Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to talk with Johannes today, the founder of Prisma and the creator of a really cool new project called Contentlayer, which I've personally been using on my website for a while now. And we're going to dive into why Contentlayer exists, some of the problems it's solving, and happy to share that it's now in beta today as well. So, Johannes, thanks for joining today.
Awesome. Hey, Lee. It's great to be back chatting and yeah, telling more people about Contentlayer. And I think even more importantly, about the problem it's solving. Since the more I've built it, the more I learned about the domain of kind of content management and how that fits into how you build modern sites and modern apps. And I've encountered a lot of like moments where I thought, wait, this isn't working and everyone has to figure this out somehow. And that sort of like one step led to another. And so Contentlayer eventually came to be. And so happy to share a bit more about it.
Yeah, so for context, I started to use Contentlayer because it was just a really easy way for me to use kind of local Markdown or also potentially remote Markdown on my Next.js website. So I'm kind of curious just to step back a little bit. Why did you make Contentlayer? Like, what was the root problem you were trying to solve?
Right. So I did most certainly not think, oh, what is the next tool I could build? I was rather trying to just accomplish whatever I wanted to accomplish. In this case, I wanted to build a website. And I actually wanted to build a website. I wanted to build actually two websites, one for someone else and one for myself. But they both had in common that I wanted to get it done quickly. I wanted to have a code base that I could maintain. And I wanted to enable someone else and also myself to make changes to the website, so mostly to the website content. And that should mean that I should not have to fiddle with whatever build tools or install new dependencies. I just want to, for example, write a new blog post or help someone manage their website. So this is kind of like a well understood topic because you have a thing like content management systems. But content management systems are also, it's kind of like a wild, messy space. So either you have something very monolithic like WordPress, but I think like a developer like you and I think we've mostly moved past that because we want to use like modern tools like React Next. And now we have to kind of figure content out again. And I think for Next in particular, I think there's kind of like two ways to go about it. So either you have kind of like local content, so Markdown files, MDX. Sometimes you even like hard code your content into your React components, or you have like a full-blown CMS or typically a headless CMS like Contentful. But so while that's now easy to describe, and I think what most people do, it's actually surprisingly hard to do it well and to kind of like have like we have such great tools today. We have like hot modular reloading, live reloading, tree shaking, all of that. But this mostly just applies to working with like little components that we're using, but to actually get the content into the app, so into our get static props, etc., that we can actually render it. There's a lot of fiddling needed for that. And I was very surprised to see how hard this is. This often, for example, if you're using local Markdown, you need to install like so many different tools like Remark, Rehype, Unified, or like MDX bundler. You need to work with the file system module to kind of traverse your file tree to get like all the Markdown files. And yeah, that's basically just a lot of work to do a very simple thing. Kind of like the OG thing itself in the internet, which is like doing websites based on content. And so I kind of built myself a little tool, how I wanted it to work. And over time, I realized, okay, this tool could be useful for others as well. And that then turned into Contentlayer. So that's on a high level, the problems I was running into. And it turned out that there's a really nice abstraction that could be built that makes it really easy for developers to bring their content as data into their application. And it's also really nice. While Contentlayer right now is mostly focused on Next.js, there's no reason why you would just use it with Next.js. You could also use it in the context of other systems. So for example, you might have for your Next.js app, you might have like a sitemap that you need. So you also need to generate that sitemap based on all of your pieces of content. So all of these sort of like content-based workflows that you need, this is what it unlocks. And so I think there's sort of like a range of different problems that you would need to solve that all Contentlayer solves for you, that unlocks a really great developer experience. So yeah, happy to go more into depth there.
The point you made about treating your content as data, I find really interesting, because for myself, kind of started as a front-end developer, then learned more about the full stack to kind of graduate to that level and learn more about the interaction between how I would get data from a database and how that data layer worked. And I became familiar with ORMs, or essentially tools that allow us to have some kind of structured way to query and grab data. And I also use Prisma on my website too, to kind of fetch data from my SQL database. And it's interesting because it provides this abstraction between, I have a database somewhere, I have a place to store data, and here's a type-safe way, because I'm using TypeScript, a type-safe way for me to actually get that in my application. And one of the big value propositions there for me is, if I need to change my database or I need to like run some migrations, this abstraction is solving that for me. So it was very interesting to take that content as data approach with Contentlayer, because I'd worked with local Markdown, I'd worked with lots of headless CMSs before, but I hadn't really thought about my content as needing an abstraction between my code and the actual, really a CMS is just a database, right? There's an abstraction on top of there. And I'm curious your opinion on this too, because I've noticed that for a lot of the modern headless CMSs, they all kind of have their own way of getting data. Maybe they have a proprietary, they have an SDK or some NPM package you can use to fetch rich text or like query content, or they have their own query language that allows them to fetch like structured content. Like there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think each one of them has some opinion to it, but I think they're all trying to solve a similar root problem that you're also looking at with Contentlayer. So maybe it'd be interesting to hear you dive more into like, what are the hard parts about content that most developers don't realize?
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot. And I think it's always specific to the context you're in. So for example, I think there's just a gazillion hard parts about working with local content. So for example, as you change that content, we're now living in such a great world with developer tools that we have live reload for everything, etc. So you also want live reload for your content, but that's not possible with out of the box here. So this needs to be taken care into account. So you need to listen to the files to be changed. But if you have, for example, if you're working on a big docs project, docs is a great use case, or blogs. If you, for example, have thousands of docs pages, and then you need to figure out, okay, when something changes, do we need to recompile everything? No, actually, you want to do incremental changes, and that sort of then actually becomes a very substantial part of your build process, and can actually become one of the slowest parts of your build process. So I've seen some projects that, or as a reference, the Gatsby docs, I saw that they have tons of the Gatsby docs themselves have tons of docs pages, which is great. But so obviously they're using Gatsby itself to build their page, and I think that took something in the orders of 20 minutes, if not more. So I've just thought, okay, let me try to use that content as a benchmark for Contentlayer, and I was able to bring down the content processing part just down to 10 seconds or so. So that just gives you the order of magnitude difference, and now you can just build it, for example, with Next.js, where you just get a really great performance out of it. So But for example, if you're using Contentful or other content sources, I'm planning to add support for Notion, for example, in the future. It's
Nice.
always, I love Notion. Use it for all my notes as well. So, and this is you pointing towards thinking about content as data. This is really like, as a developer, you're working with data. As a developer, what does content even mean? Content is almost like more of a rendering, but on the thing underneath is where you need data, and that data you can put into your React components, into like pass down as props, etc. So, and it's always a question for how do you get the data out? How do you get the content out of your content source, Contentful, local Markdown files, etc. And then you want to transform it into data. And once you start thinking in this way, it becomes very intuitive and very simple to deal with. And it fits wonderfully into all of the great tools that we have today with Webpack or like our more modern equivalents. And you can apply all the great methods on it. You can have like hot module reloading, you can have tree shaking, and you can actually get substantial improvements, for example, for your Lighthouse score based on that, just by doing more, sort of like letting your build tools do more for you.
So can we talk more about the incrementalism? Because I'm assuming that actually your point about Gatsby was interesting to me, because would you consider Gatsby's GraphQL layer, like they talk about it as a data layer, right? It's kind of in a similar way. Is it trying to solve some of the same problems as Contentlayer? Because I know they're thinking about like stitching together multiple pieces of data into one data layer, which is using GraphQL. So your analogy there, basically, were you saying you took that idea, but then you added this incrementalism to it, so you kind of only allowed you to kind of only rebuild what's needed. I've been thinking a lot about incrementalism, talking about Turbo a lot, Turbo Repo, and totally. There's some shared ideas there.
100%. Fun fact: we're using the code base of Contentlayer is using Turbo to speed up its own build. So that's nice. Great. So yeah, two points on that. You can think about, you mentioning Gatsby as an analogy. You can think about Gatsby basically as like I think it's a brilliant piece of technology at the time, and I think it pioneered a lot of the great ways of going about things that embrace GraphQL, etc. And I think it really embraced the idea of turning content into data and then letting you specify which data you want and bringing that into your React app. Mm-hmm. I think I've used it myself, and it worked quite well for me. But I think in a lot of cases, it felt a little bit too heavyweight. There was like even though I was like one of the early adopters of GraphQL, etc., that doesn't mean that you need to use it everywhere. Yeah. And in order to do it right, and like I also want like get type safety, etc., you needed to do a lot of stuff. Like you needed to install a lot of tools to do a fairly simple thing. So in my perspective, GraphQL in the context of simpler content-based sites is probably rather overkill. Mm-hmm. And this was also a goal for Contentlayer, just to make it as simple as possible, to really break it down to the atomic pieces of complexity, to kind of the existential complexity of it, and then try to come up with the most simple API for it. And this is when you look at how you actually use your data, your content data with Contentlayer, you literally use the JavaScript import keyword to get it. So import is kind of like your query language. And this applies both for like replacing something like GraphQL, whether it's in the local use case or whether it's for a headless CMS. Since for a headless CMS, you have so much ceremony you need to take care of just to get your content into the website. So I wanted to make that dramatically easier. So that simplicity and therefore unlocking a great developer experience, that's kind of one core tenet of what Contentlayer is trying to accomplish. And the other is performance. since content is such a wild beast that like while trying to solve all of the problems, typically performance is kind of thought of last. And then you have for your sites, you have build times in the orders of like tens of minutes. I've seen websites that, for example, use Contentful, where you just inefficiently get that data, and then suddenly you have a build time of 1.5 hours. This is no joke. There's like really websites that take that long. And just by using Contentlayer and being a bit more smart about like how you pull that data and being incremental about it, I've brought that down to like the order of like 3 minutes. So you can really, if you think about it intentionally and put it together nicely, you can get so many benefits out of it. And
so what are those specific type of optimizations that allow you to speed up a build from an hour to 3 minutes? Because maybe an analogy here that might help me make sense is if you're thinking about GraphQL and you pull out a fragment, you can like cache a fragment, or you can reuse a fragment in multiple queries. So I could be completely wrong with this, but is it you're defining your content, and then Contentlayer is saying, here's the parts where I can more intelligently make a query to fetch the data and cache that to prevent excessive overquerying? Is that kind of what's happening there?
So I think using the word query is interesting. And this was, for me, one of the major design decisions I needed to make early for Contentlayer, whether I want to have a query system in it or not. And I've decided against having a query system in it, and rather, as said, like letting you use import, just importing the data as is. And then you have basically like your own query system in your, for example, get static props method. Since in there, you can just get the data, no matter how you got it. In this case, you import it. And then you can do to it whatever you want. You can map it, you can filter it, you can search through it, etc. And then you just use all the next primitives to pass it down into your React app. That means also you can reduce it down to the minimal amount of data that you need for that view.
Yep.
And that's where you get like fast build times out of it, etc. And so this also means you can basically think about it in steps. So the first step that always happens in the background or in parallel in your build process is that you turn all your content that you think you might need, you turn that into data. Data in this case literally means pieces of JSON that just sit on your file system and are ready to be used by your application, by your next step. And that basically means and that's all that Contentlayer really does. It takes the content from a source like local Markdown files and validates it and transforms it and saves it as local JSON files. It conveniently exposes these JSON files as an ESM module, so you can just do import. And on top, because I really like TypeScript, and the world seems to like TypeScript as well, where also Contentlayer also generates TypeScript definitions for it, and it validates this content. So you can always rest assured that the content is actually you have integrity for your content, so you don't have like any Markdown front matter fields missing, etc. And from that point on forward, all the crazy performance optimizations, why it's so fast, is actually due to how great Next.js and like these modern build tools are, because now you can actually just rely on the incremental builds, etc. of Next.js. And the other important part about it, and I've actually prepared a little benchmark suite with 3 examples on it. Maybe I share my screen and quickly demonstrate this. So we have 3 examples here. We have one with Next and Remark, which is just a simple Markdown-based setup. Then we have one with Next and Contentlayer, and we have one with Gatsby. And we have a script that basically just generates 1,001 pages, one overview page and 10,000 subpages. They're all unique, so they can't be cached individually. Yeah, we've benchmarked this, and it basically came out like this: that we look at it in a cold case, so when you run it the first time, and then also if you run it a second time. So why you might look at that separately is maybe in CI with Turbo, for example, you can remember previous runs and really speed things up, but also in local development, that really matters. And yeah, these were the results that in the cold case, a total build. So it's not just the content layer part. The content layer part is actually a teeny tiny part of it, but this shows like how using content layer can unlock the full potential of the underlying site framework. So here you see that content layer and next takes 25 seconds in the cold case and 16 seconds in the warm case. Whereas like Gatsby here took like warm just as much as content layer took in the cold case. But not looking too much at Gatsby here, but I think the more interesting comparison is here with Next and Remark, where you see quite a substantial penalty in this case. And again, the reason for this is if most pages, and I think your blog has been built in a similar way in the past, if you look at this dynamic subpage, is that you would, for every page, you would call, like in a get static props, something along these lines. So you're looking at the slug from the URL, and then you're trying to somehow scramble and get the data from that that you need on that page. And that might look something like this. So we remember we had this I think page by URL path. Here you basically just need to do a whole bunch of stuff. You need to look at the file system. You need to think about paths. Then you even haven't thought about, oh, should this work on Windows as well? And then you need to do like all of like the content processing. And at this point, this is already enough complexity. We haven't even thought about like subdirectories. We haven't thought about like all sorts of things. And this is complex enough that like you're happy if you get it to work in the first place. But for you then to think about like an incremental caching strategy, etc., like no one would do that, or not if you just want to get your site up and running. And by just doing that, you can and batching things, you can see some really significant performance benefits. And yeah, but performance is really just one of the pieces of content layer. And the developer experience part, I think this is what you really get to see when you build a site with content layer, and you can just work on your content and you see it live in your application.
If you go back to the pages and to the get static paths too, I think this is kind of what you were talking about earlier when you mentioned that a site was able to go from potentially hours long builds down to just minutes. And I believe what you were talking about is how inside of get static paths, you can basically specify the amount of data that you want to pre-build versus the amount of data that you want to kind of do on demand. So in this instance, your benchmark was all 1001 pages you were generating as individual paths. But then, if you have 10,000 pages or 100,000 pages, maybe you only want your build time to be limited by the top maybe 1,000, right? Maybe you only want to do the top 1,000, and then you can offload the rest to get generated on demand. So you can kind of have it's a trade-off that the framework enables you to make.
Totally. And yeah, ultimately it's basically you're just importing JSON. So it's really flexible for you to think about this. And I think it sort of gives you it basically fully embraces one of the best qualities of like what static builds unlock you. And then with sort of like the incremental and dynamic nature, you can seamlessly add this on top to, like you say, get the best of both worlds.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's cool. I'd be curious to see, is this Is this next site, is it using Babel or is it using SWC? It's on
Um,
12.1,
yeah.
right?
So this is just a performance benchmark suite. So I think yeah, this is using 12.1. And I think this is using just plain default. So I think this uses probably SWC, no?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
by default in Next.js 12, it uses SWC for compilation for next build. Um,
exactly.
you can also opt in for minification, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there, I think this is, I was very particular about this with the way how I designed Contentlayer, that the contract, how it's being used in a side framework like Next or in others, that
Mhm.
there's nothing specific that like could be in the way, but it's really just that you're importing your data as that you're importing your content as data like this, and this is all there is to the API. For all intensive purposes, you could import this from a different file, and someone could have created this by hand, and it would just still work. But it's
Mhm.
basically Contentlayer is just this little saint behind the scene who is just maintaining this data constantly in a very fast and efficient way. And then on top, and I can quickly show this here in this example, where if we change some of this content, so we can say here, hi Lee, and then you see it as like live reloading here instantly. We can add new paragraph, and this live reloads instantly.
Nice.
And yeah, and all that's necessary to get this to work is really that you define what does a document look like. So we saw over here we have a title and we have a date,
Mhm.
and that's just what we're specifying here. And this gives us basically the affordance of that Contentlayer checks that your content is actually having the shape that you want. So, for example, if I would forget to provide the date here, you see here I'm immediately getting a nice error message or a warning that this is missing and that it now skips this document. And yeah, and even like if you have an other field, then it also tells you about this. So it kind of helps you to keep your content nicely in shape.
Hmm.
And then if you're using TypeScript, you also get the benefit of getting automatically TypeScript type definitions generated based on what you've defined here. And yeah, so that's sort of like a very simple case of what an app with Contentlayer or a site with Contentlayer looks like. But this scales incredibly well, so into the hundreds of thousands of like documents, but also so this is called like a content schema, basically similar to how you have a database schema. This is kind of like your content schema, but you could have like a very sophisticated setup with like, I don't know, like 50 of different document types, and they can actually reference each other, etc. So you can build like you could build like a little New York Times based on that with like all the bits and pieces.
And in a local Markdown file, you're using front matter for your fields. But if we were using Contentful or something here, you can pull those, you can define your fields and they could be types on your content model in Contentful, right?
Exactly. So there is a experimental version of Contentful already there. So just to give you an idea for how that looks like, since in the Contentful case, you actually don't need to specify all of this, since you've already went through the trouble once and clickety clacked your way through the Contentful interface. So the way how it would work with Contentful is that you would basically in your Contentlayer config, you would just say, so here you see make source plugin, you import this from Contentful. And here just specify your access token, space ID in the environment. And then it basically introspects Contentful. So it checks out with Contentful, like, hey, tell me about like all your document types.
Mm-hmm.
And then it pulls it down. So it automatically does that and generates TypeScript definitions based on what you have in Contentful, which is really cool. But you can also override it like here. So if you want to, for example, you have it, maybe you have a document type that's called blog, but locally in your app, you want to have it called post, you can override it like this.
Wow. That's awesome. It kind of reminds me of what I really liked about Gatsby is just an incredible community of plugins that made it easy for you to, like as a beginner, it was easy for you to hook into different pieces of content and build that data layer. So it is really compelling here that that same idea is kind of abstracted out to something that kind of any framework or just any website could take advantage of.
Right. But I'm bringing it back here to really like a core value for me of simplicity.
Yeah.
I went through the trouble of like build a Gatsby plugin, etc. And that was since you have the baseline complexity of like a GraphQL schema, which I was very familiar with, and still it was sort of a non-trivial undertaking to basically bring whenever I fell off the happy path of Gatsby and I wanted to do something custom, turned out like you very often need to do something custom. And so that meant I had to build my own plugin, or I was using another plugin. And as the system evolves, these plugins got out of date, etc. And you're just busy with keeping your NPM, gardening your NPM dependencies.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make it very simple, and basically you just get a data representation, and we can take a look into it. So here, all posts, we can click into this, and we see here that we basically have like a little NPM, like a little pack, a little module here generated for us.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have the all posts. And the all posts here are just, if we click into that, it is literally just importing the various JSON documents here. So for example, here, let's see this side by side. Here we have hi Lee, etc. Mm-hmm. If we change this, this automatically live reloads. And all there is to it is really that it just exports this. And here we're importing it. And anything that I want to extend on top of that, I can just do here in my get static props or get static paths, get static props. And there's like no sophisticated thing that I need to learn on top of it to extend my schema. There's a very simple concept if you'd want to do that on the content layer side, where you have the concept of computed fields. So for example, here we're deriving a URL field based on some of like the file system paths, but you could just as well do it here.
Got it. Yeah, that's I empathize with where you're coming from, because it's my larger point is the simplicity for a new user of a plugin system can be very appealing. When you peel back the layers of the onion there, plugins are very difficult to do well, and there's a abstraction cost there that you need to nail such that it's not too much of an abstraction, or building on top of GraphQL in that instance is kind of difficult. So I like the approach you've taken here, where it's like the same kind of in user experience. Like I want to make it easy to get my content on my site, and then empower that through a better developer experience of how you actually use the tools together.
Exactly. And I think there's still something to be said for a tool like Gatsby if you really want to embrace all of that complexity. But I think for most sites, like your blog, I think is a great example, which is really like already a sizable app/site. Yeah. But it's still, your content purposes are actually very simple. And either you would do it yourself, or maybe if you use a tool like Gatsby, that would, for the content purposes, already be overkill. So I wanted to have for sort of like a a simple abstraction that scales across like the dimensions of how many pieces of content you have, how your application scales, and I think just on a higher on a higher end where you have like a ridiculous amount of like complex use cases, a tool like Gatsby might be still getting you a bit of extra mileage out of it, but you really need to lean into that complexity, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Cool.
that was very insightful. I feel like I know more about the complexities of what it takes to deal with content than I did before. And yeah, I've been happy using Contentlayer. I'm excited to see it grow. What maybe one final thing is, what do you feel like? What do you feel like makes a stable release? What makes it out of beta?
Yeah, good question. So, yeah, by the time I think this video goes live, we'll have content layer released, and by we, I mostly mean me, but I also get the help from some of the community members, and this work is currently sponsored by a company called Stackbit, and they're also helping with the beta launch as well. So yeah, right now, Contentlayer has approached its beta level of maturity. That means I think the shape overall is there, and we want to basically give people a signal to like, hey, this is now ready to be used.
Mm-hmm.
The very cutting edge early adopters have been already starting to use it, like yourself included.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, for example, already over 300 open source projects be based on top of Contentlayer. So that's, I think,
Nice.
a very nice vote of confidence. And now it's basically about adding more support for different content sources. So I mentioned like Notion, for example. I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
Contentful, but also other content sources. And then really just embracing whatever feedback we're getting. So we've been we had a lot of activity in GitHub issues where people reported, okay, here's a little limitation. So I try to be as responsive as possible to cut a new release that addresses this, and sort of just like this polishing process. And hopefully the beta stage now confirms all of like the abstractions how they were designed initially. But if it turns out that overall the shape should be changed in a slightly different way to unlock more use cases, to make it even simpler, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
then I think before it hits 1.0 in GA, it might still be the right point in time to make some of the more drastic changes, even though I don't see them coming right now. But yeah, having learned quite a few lessons from how we evolve Prisma, etc., I rather have a couple of more dedicated, intentional stages of maturity.
Yeah.
And seems like the community is really embracing that right now.
Which I'm excited about the future roadmap too, because I think at some point I would like to move my content from my repo to Notion or to some
Yeah.
external source, just because it lends better to people forking the repo and not having to like delete all of the existing
Oh
content that's
yeah.
in there. So maybe I'll take advantage of that Notion package in the
Yeah,
future.
I'm really looking forward to that as well, since I think it's also similar to, I think get static props is such a great abstraction because it doesn't care where you pull stuff down from, whether
Mm-hmm.
you like read a local JSON file or whether you make an HTTP call somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very I'm very excited about the idea of like having Contentlayer support multiple content sources at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So you could imagine having still some pages locally in Markdown in your repo, but
Mm-hmm.
having some other, maybe like something that maybe feels more like notes, pulling that down from Notion, and
Yep.
having again some other things, maybe treating GitHub issues as a content source as well, and bringing that all together, all with the
Mm-hmm.
same simple mental model. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk today and walk through this. Very excited
Yeah,
about its
for
future.
sure. I had a lot of fun. I think your questions have been just the right ones, very focused on the problems that it's solving. And yeah, hopefully this will be useful for others as well. I'm always very receptive to feedback, and yeah, we have a Discord community. We have a GitHub issue, a list where you're happy to provide your feedback. So I can't wait to hear from others using it.
Awesome. Contentlayer.dev. Check it out. Try the beta, and thanks for watching.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee.